The Americans, Chapter 15, Immigrants and Urbanization. Section 2, The Challenges of Urbanization. In 1870, at age 21, Jacob Riis left his native Denmark for the United States. Riis found work as a police reporter, a job that took him into some of New York City's worst slums, where he was shocked at the conditions in the overcrowded, airless, filthy tenements. Riis used his talents to expose the hardships of New York City's poor. A personal voice, Jacob Riis.
Be a little careful, please. The hall is dark, and you might stumble over the children pitching pennies back there. Not that it would hurt them. Kicks and cuffs are their daily diet. They have little else. Close, stuffy, yes. And would you have? All that fresh air that ever enters these stairs comes from the hall door that is forever slamming. Here is a door. Listen. That short hacking cough, that tiny helpless wail. What do they mean? The child is dying with measles. With half of a chance it might have lived, but it had none. That dark bedroom killed it.
Making a living in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was not easy. Natural and economic disasters had hit farmers hard in Europe and in the United States, and the promise of industrial jobs drew millions of people to American cities. The urban population exploded from 10 million to 54 million between 1870 and 1920. This growth revitalized the cities, but also created serious problems that, as Riis observed, had a powerful impact on the new urban poor. Part 1. Urban Opportunities. The technological boom of the 19th century contributed to the growing industrial strength of the United States. The result was rapid urbanization, or growth of cities, mostly in the regions of the Northeast and Midwest. Immigrants settle in cities. Most of the immigrants who steamed into the United States in the late 19th century became city dwellers because cities were the cheapest and most convenient places to live. Cities also offered unskilled laborers steady jobs in mills and factories. By 1890, there were twice as many Irish residents in New York City as in Dublin, Ireland. By 1910, immigrant families made up more than half of the total population of 18 major American cities. The Americanization movement was designed to assimilate people of wide-ranging cultures into the dominant culture. This social campaign was sponsored by the government and by concerned citizens. Schools and voluntary associations provided programs to teach immigrants skills needed for citizenship, such as English literacy and American history and government. Subjects such as cooking and social etiquette were included in the curriculum to help the newcomers learn the ways of native-born Americans. Despite their efforts, many immigrants did not wish to abandon their traditions. Ethnic communities provided the social support of other immigrants from the same country. This enabled them to speak their own languages and practice their customs and religion. However, these neighborhoods soon became overcrowded, a problem that was intensified by the arrival of new transplants from America's rural areas. Migration from country to city. Rapid improvements in farming technology during the second half of the 19th century were good news for some farmers, but bad news for others. Inventions such as the McCormick reaper and the steel plow made farming more efficient, but meant fewer laborers were needed to work the land. As more and more farms merged, many rural people moved to cities to find whatever work they could. Many of the southern farmers who lost their livelihoods were African Americans. Between 1890 and 1910, about 200,000 African Americans moved north and west to cities such as Chicago and Detroit, in an effort to escape racial violence, economic hardship, and political oppression. Many found conditions only somewhat better than they had left behind. Segregation and discrimination were often the reality in northern cities. Job competition between black and white immigrants caused further racial tensions. Part 2. Urban Problems. As the urban population skyrocketed, city governments faced the problem of how to provide residents with needed services and safe living conditions. Housing. When the industrial age began, working class farmers in cities had two housing options. They could either buy a house on the outskirts of town where they would face transportation problems, or rent cramped rooms in a boarding house in the central city. As the urban population increased, however, new types of housing were designed. For example, row houses, single-family dwellings that shared side walls with other similar houses, packed many single-family residents into a single block. After working-class families left the central city, immigrants often took over their old housing, sometimes with 2 or 3 families occupying a one-family residence. As Jacob Riis pointed out, these multifamily urban dwellings, called tenements, were overcrowded and unsanitary. In 1879, to improve such slum conditions, New York City passed a law that set minimum standards for plumbing and ventilation in apartments. Landlords began building tenements with air shafts that provided an outside window for each room. Since garbage was picked up infrequently, people sometimes dumped it into the air shafts, where it might attract vermin. To keep out the stench, residents nailed windows shut. Though established with good intent, these new tenements soon became even worse places to live than the converted single-family residences. Transportation. Innovations in mass transit, transportation systems designed to move large numbers of people along fixed routes, enabled workers to go to and from jobs more easily. Streetcars were introduced in San Francisco in 1873 and electric subways in Boston in 1897. By the early 20th century, mass transit networks in many urban areas linked city neighborhoods to one another and to outlying communities. Cities struggled to repair old transit systems and to build new ones to meet the demands of an expanding population. Water. Cities also faced the problems of supporting safe drinking water. As the urban population grew in the 1840s and 1850s, cities such as New York and Cleveland built public waterworks to handle the increasing demand. As late as the 1860s, however, the residents of many cities had grossly inadequate piped water, or none at all. Even in large cities like New York, homes seldom had indoor plumbing, and residents had to collect water in pails from faucets on the street and heat it for bathing. The necessity of improving water quality to control diseases such as cholera and typhoid fever was obvious. To make city water safer, filtration was introduced in the 1870s and chlorination in 1908. However, in the early 20th century, many city dwellers still had no access to safe water. Sanitation. As the cities grew, so did the challenge of keeping them clean. Horse manure piled up on the streets, sewage flowed through open gutters, and factories spewed foul smoke into the air. Without dependable trash collection, people dumped their garbage on the streets. Although private contractors called scavengers were hired to sweep the streets, collect garbage, and clean outhouses, they often did not do the jobs properly. By 1900, many cities had developed sewer lines and created sanitation departments. However, the task of providing hygienic living conditions was an ongoing challenge for urban leaders. Crime. As the population of cities increased, pickpockets and thieves flourished. Although New York City organized the first full-time salaried police force in 1844, it and most other city law enforcement units were too small to have much of an impact on crime. Fire. The limited water supply in many cities contributed to another menace, the spread of fires. Major fires occurred in almost every large American city during the 1870s and 1880s. In addition to lacking water with which to combat blazes, most cities were packed with wooden dwellings, which were like kindling waiting to be ignited. The use of candles and kerosene heaters also posed a fire hazard. In San Francisco, deadly fires often broke out during earthquakes. Jack London described the fires that raged after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. A personal voice, Jack London. On Wednesday morning at 5:15 came the earthquake. A minute later, the flames were leaping upward. In a dozen different quarters south of Market Street, in the working-class ghetto, and in the factories, fires started. There was no opposing the flames. and the great water mains had burst. All the shrewd contrivances and safeguards of man had been thrown out of gear by 30 seconds twitching of the earth crust. At first, most city firefighters were volunteers and not always available when they were needed. Cincinnati, Ohio tackled this problem when it established the nation's first paid fire department in 1853. By 1900, most cities had full-time professional fire departments. The introduction of practical automatic fire sprinklers in 1874 and the replacement of wood as a building material with brick, stone, or concrete also made cities safer. Part 3. Reformers mobilize. As problems in cities mounted, concerned Americans worked to find solutions. Social welfare reformers targeted their efforts at relieving urban poverty. The Settlement House Movement. An early reform program, the Social Gospel Movement, preached salvation through service to the poor, inspired by the message of the social gospel movement. Many 19th century reformers responded to the call to help the urban poor. In the late 1800s, a few reformers established settlement houses, community centers in slum neighborhoods that provided assistance to people in the area, especially immigrants. Many settlement workers lived in the houses so that they could learn firsthand about the problems caused by urbanization and help create solutions. Run largely by middle-class, college-educated women, settlement houses provided educational, cultural, and social services. They provided classes in such subjects as English, health, and painting, and offered college extension courses. Settlement houses often sent visiting nurses into the homes of the sick and provided whatever aid was needed to secure support for deserted women, insurance for bewildered widows, damages for injured operators, furniture from the clutches of the installment store. Settlement houses in the United States were founded by Charles Stover and Stanton Colt in New York City in 1886. Jane Addams, one of the most influential members of the movement, and Ellen Gates Starr founded Chicago's Hull House in 1889. In 1890, Janie Porter Barrett founded Locust Street Social Settlement in Hampton, Virginia, the first settlement house for African Americans. By 1910, about 400 settlement houses were operating in cities across the country. The settlement houses helped cultivate social responsibility toward the urban poor.